some of the places that I had seen people were coming from, which just makes this all the more exciting. So welcome to you all. I think, New Zealand too. Wow, this is just really exciting. And once we get to the, to opening it up after a brief intro, we'll get to find out more about y'all. We are expecting quite a number of folks. So we're going to be working on chat communications because it will be just too hard to coordinate that many people trying to get in on voice. So I think that way we'll be able to actually hear what you all want to say and ask and so forth, even though we don't have the pleasure of seeing your faces and hearing your voices. But we know you're here, and it's wonderful to have you. So this is the Ask Me Anything. And the title of this Ask Me Anything, excuse me, is entitled Ask Me Anything About Stigma and Stigma Resistance, the #1 reason for peer worker turnover. So first I want to say our title isn't grammatically correct because, of course, stigma resistance isn't the cause of turnover, but instead feeling disrespected and devalued as peer workers. So we figured you got that, and we'll talk about all of that, what people experience and the great strategies to overcome. We'll be doing all of that despite our not well grammatically crafted title. Also, I want to say one thing about language before we get going, because this has been a dilemma for us. The word stigma is really not an accurate word at all to describe what we're going to be discussing. Stigma actually, if we go to the dictionary, means a mark of shame. And stigma is something that people carry within them or that the people own themselves. But what we're talking about really is prejudice and discrimination, and how negative beliefs about a group of people that are perceived as different can turn into consequential actions against this group of people, either individually or as a group. And in this case, we're really thinking about peer workers who go into a traditional behavioral health setting and are greeted with more or less full engagement and full welcome. And that's what we're going to be getting, what we're going to be talking about today. The problem that we run into when we're also bringing research into the picture, and Anneliese will talk about that more, is that in the literature historically, it has been referred to as stigma. So if you want to look up previous research, or if you want to publish your own, the term of art out there is stigma. We try to thread this needle, and we want to continue to work as we have as a center to move away from that erroneous word, mostly because people with lived experience, and I'll speak from my own experience, it's very easy to absorb those negative beliefs about you. And so when the language we use just reinforces that it's something within you, it strengthens those negative beliefs. So we believe as a center, and in this webinar, we're also going to maintain that we're going to be talking about prejudice and discrimination, recognizing that the research term that we're relying on is stigma. So we're going to thread that needle the best we can. And we're going to, hopefully we'll do this together today. It's been a dilemma, and we hope that bringing the awareness reminds us all that it's not stigma, it's prejudice and discrimination. And we'll bring that back with us as well to remind ourselves constantly of this. So with that being said, I thought it was just important, and thank you in the chat for reinforcing that you're also on the same page with us on that. That's really important to us. So today we have two panelists for this AMA. And I'm going to switch my hat right now from facilitator to one of your panelists, but I'm going to let the other panelist, Anneliese de Wet, be the first to introduce herself, and then I'll introduce myself as a panelist instead of the facilitator. Anneliese, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you, Lynn. Can everybody hear me? You can hear me?
Hats while you're talking.
Thank you so much. And thanks for everyone taking the time to be here today to join this webinar. It's really an honor for me to be talking to you, talking with you about this topic, something that I feel very passionate about. And so a little background about myself, what brings me here today and why I think Lynn invited me, is that my interest in this topic started with my recovery research in South Africa. I'm originally from South Africa. I spoke there to many persons about their experiences of their own recovery. As you may imagine, the study of mental health recovery in South Africa is not yet as far developed as it is here in the US. But what I heard people say to me in our conversations was that they share similar hopes, aspirations, and dreams for their lives than people here in the US, of living a meaningful life of their choosing. And this really inspired me, and the research ultimately made me think about the very usefulness that peer support could have, or the usefulness of it in the South African or in a South African context, where peer supports exist somewhat informally and only in very small pockets, but not at all at the scale that you have in the US here already. So in South Africa, material financial resources are really limited, extremely limited. And I realized that persons with lived experience could possibly help to overcome these limitations by being trained as support others challenged by mental health conditions as peer specialists. And I've also learned that in the meantime that some mental health organizations in South Africa have actually taken steps towards training peer specialists. And this makes me very excited about the future of peer specialists in South Africa and the difference that it really could make there. And because of this realization about this usefulness of peer support in South Africa, I wanted to learn more about exactly what peer support is, how it's done, what works, what doesn't work. And this brought me to the Center for Psychiatric Rehabilitation in 2021. So I've been at the Center for Psych Rehab since 2021 for a research project that I've been doing the past 2 years. I spoke to peer specialists all over the US, and I asked them about their experiences of prejudice and discrimination in the workplace as peer specialists, and tried to understand what those experiences looked like for them, how they responded to those experiences in trying to shield themselves or withstand those experiences. And so you can hear my language, I really try to steer clear from the use of that, stigma in conversations. This project was really very rewarding and humbling experience for me because I learned about the very challenging conditions in which many peer specialists work, and yet how resilient they are in addressing those challenges for themselves, especially when it comes to prejudice and discrimination. In the academic literature, as Lynn has mentioned before, earlier, also this resilience is referred to as stigma resistance. This is a problematic language term, as I agree with Lynn, absolutely. And then in the research, as I mentioned, I really tried to steer clear of that. I really tried to not use that. I rather focused on using the words shielding or withstanding prejudice and discrimination. I think it's more accurate in describing people's experiences. And in this project, just to give you some idea of what I heard people talk about, people told me a lot about different forms of prejudice and discrimination they were experiencing on the job. I learned that there are many different strategies that people used in these situations for these experiences, to address these experiences. These strategies range from support seeking to confrontation, educating others about prejudice and discrimination, advocacy, being involved in advocacy, and reinforcing the value of peer support, just to mention a few of the strategies. There are a host of other strategies. And many peer specialists also shared with me how using these strategies helped them overcome these experiences by feeling less vulnerable, more empowered, and as a result, several people mentioned to me saying, it's not about me. So moving from that feeling of it's about me to a feeling of it's not about me. And that was a wonderful message to hear, that using stigma resistance, those strategies really help people to move to that place where they realize that it's not about them.
That's great. Well, thank you, Anneliese. And we're going to open the, I don't know, we're going to invite you in a few minutes to ask questions of Anneliese of all the things that she learned and the strategies that peer workers use to stay in challenging work environments. And I'm here on the other side of the title, which is the number one, thing that causes job turnover. That's just because I've had many years of experience with training, certifying peer support workers, implementing peer support into the workforce, trying to work with agencies to have them better equipped and better engaging and inviting for peer workers. So I've had a lot of experience on that end on the ground. So I'm here to answer other questions sort of around this whole thing of peer workers trying to bring a different culture into a workforce that's very set in its medical modeled, moving towards recovery-oriented culture, right? And the ways that it's been successful and the ways that there have been challenges on bringing these two cultures to work together for the goal of bettering the lives of people that are coming for services. So sort of the door is open for questions all around that from y'all. Use the chat for that. And I know we got a couple from email, which might be the best place to start. So Amanda, do you want to let us know what one of those are? Maybe not. I have one right here. I have it handy.
Okay, so when I was looking through them.
That's all right. I have it handy. I'm sorry. I put you on the spot. So I'm going to say the one from the person from Uganda. I'm not sure if he's made it on, so I'm going to give him a few more minutes. So here's one question that we got, which is sort of the heart of a lot of this that we're talking about. So it might be a good one to start us off with. And it says, how best, this is written from a peer worker, I believe peer worker or a peer supervisor, a director of a team, okay. Of peers working in an inpatient setting in forensics. And so I thought this is a great one to start us off with because it's probably the most challenging environment that peer workers are trying to work in. So he says in the question, I have no doubt that our staff turnover has been heavily impacted by things like moral injury, stereotype threat, and observing things which we recognize as disrespectful and discriminatory. All of this takes place in an environment which is rigid due to a variety of factors. Did your research, Anneliese, bring to light anything which seems to help to improve workforce resilience for those of us working in settings which are less aligned with peer values and which are more resistant to change? How's that for a good one to get us?
Absolutely. And thank you so much for that question. I think it's a great one. And I agree, it's the forensic settings are probably the most challenging. I agree with you, Lynn. It's really a setting that doesn't align with peer values and the living of peer values and the and I was, thinking about this question, thinking that I really think for peer specialists working in those settings, I think the issue of seeking support, the strategy of seeking support outside of those settings is probably a very good one. I think that, finding resources, because I think it can be very challenging to be faced with the limitations of that setting, of the forensic setting. And I think there were some participants in the study that I conducted who were working in similar settings, in correctional facilities, and were, faced with a lot of those limitations. And I think about advocacy work, being involved in advocacy, calling on not only, support in terms of family or friends, but also colleagues, other peer support colleagues, who can, support one, and also support the peer specialists to advocate for change in environments that are so restrictive. And I think it's really important. Something that came up is a lot of peer specialists work on their own in settings, and that can be really, really demanding, to have to do that on your own. So I think that's really important to seek support in doing that, especially if you're on your own, in an environment like that. So yeah, that's my first answer on that question.
And I'll add a little bit more on this. Part of it is, what Anneliese has talked a lot about is what are people learning to do once they're on the job to feel that they're able to stay, do their job, be satisfied, despite the environment. The other piece of it, which we don't really think enough about, is the training, the people coming into the field, knowing what the field is, and then going for jobs, knowing what the jobs are, rather than getting in there and going, oh my God, what have I gotten myself into? I think there's a coolness about becoming a peer supporter. And so people on their own and people from being encouraged by providers go into peer work without always having a good orientation to what does the job look like in the real world. And I don't think our peer trainings do well either with doing real world sort of activities, so people really get a sense of what they're getting into. So I think this is something that we work on both ends, right? Try to help people up front to make choices that are going to be consistent with their needs and their values, and then help them build that resiliency in the work setting, in those strategies that Anneliese was talking about, right? Making those connections. The biggest one that she always brings home, it's not about me, you know, it's just sort of the environment. It's not personal strategies. So I think all of those are really good. All right.
Yes, if I can add to that, and I think really that you know, it's important for folks to remember you know, the importance just of that, you know, the strategies, but also learning from others. And I think from our research, I think the conclusion that I came to was really what you're saying, you know, that initial training could include ways of you know, using strategies so in the workplace.
Yeah.
And I really would like, you know, to advocate, and I think I'm in a process still of continuing this research, hopefully. And really, you know, the aim is to bring that into training for peer specialists to develop those strategies before they even get on the job. You know, realizing the different contexts that you might be in and what strategies you could use in those contexts to withstand and to shield yourself.
I think that's a great idea. So all of you out there who are still involved in peer training, note that and get in touch with Anneliese if you want more support with that. Another question that came from Elizabeth, who's with us. She says, how can I connect with the research community and or learn best practices to track outcomes for our organization's peer work? That's a great question. She's running a peer-led organization, but I think it's true for any of us who are doing any projects around peer support innovations. How can we be tracking those outcomes and connecting with researchers? I leave that to you, Anneliese. Your thoughts.
I think so. I'm just trying to think about, you know, I think being involved in research, so as a participant, can be a great way of, you know, connecting with researchers. Researchers are very often, you know, and especially researchers in our field, I find have a passion for the work that they do and are happy to share and happy to support where they can. So I think being involved in research really is a great way to connect with researchers. They're always, you know, through NAPS. I think folks on this call probably would know NAPS. But through NAPS, they're always advertising different research projects that are going on. Being involved in that would really connect you with researchers and build up that network of researchers. And of course, at the center, you know, we have a lot of resources. So if you visit our website, I'm sure you guys are familiar with that, having come to this webinar. But there are a lot of resources that can support peer specialists.
Yeah, and I would say to anybody who's involved in peer-run organizations, I would check with some of the national centers, like the National Empowerment Center, because they can connect you. There are researchers throughout the country who have been involved with helping peer organizations do good research. I know there's Mark Salta up in Philadelphia, but the National Empowerment Center would certainly know who those people are and be able to connect you with them. I'm also putting my email in the chat box right now. So anyone, you know, if you need a resource, feel free to reach out to us and we'll do our best as well to get that.
I can put mine in there too, Lynn, and
right.
folks are happy. I'm happy if folks want to contact me.
Yeah. And I'm seeing a lot in the chat, couldn't agree more, that we need to be training the teams. We need to be training the peer support supervisors. Because what we did is we got funding to train and place peer support workers with none of the other work that is so vital of working with the agency. So as one person said, half the people still don't even know what a peer support is, what they should do. Absolutely. So that's not sort of this webinar, but all of that is true. We could have a webinar on every single one of those things. Sadly, we've come a long way, actually, believe it or not, since our 1999 or 99, when peer support became Medicaid approved in this country. It was a big shift, a big roll of funding, and a lot of the very first peer workers went in and broke down some barriers and made some progress. Still a long, long way to go. So thank you all. This is all such important, good stuff about really how do we get more money to do more training, because that's what's needed.
And I want to connect with what you said now about, the training, not only for the peer specialist, because very often I can imagine for peer specialists, it must feel like they have to do the work to overcome, and they have to accommodate, and and I think that really it's very important for organizations, to also be trained in that, and to be trained in these topics, trained in who peer specialists are, because what I heard from a lot of the participants is that it's up to them to educate others. And there's a turnover in staff, so that means that they're constantly having to train new people coming in. And that's a big burden to carry, on top of the prejudice and discrimination they experience. So I think it really is, it has to come from both sides. It has to be strengthening the peer specialist workforce, but also educating and changing the values within an organization.
Yeah, absolutely. And John commented, he's a Massachusetts person, so I'm gonna address, because I know exactly what he's talking about. In all the trainings across the country and across the world are different. That's one of our problems. But I think we can say that all peer worker training sort of fall on three core pieces. One is that one-on-one peer support, sharing lived experience, right? Another piece is to be a change agent. And that one doesn't go over as well. And then the third leg, which I think is hard even for peer workers to hold on to, is the really difficult role of being in, but not of the system. To be there, bring the work in, but not get co-opted into the system that you're working with. And Tanya was writing, about some of her experiences working as a young adult peer mentor, and they're really no different. The young adult peer mentors and the CPSs are all in this place where they're in a foreign culture. And the foreign culture naturally wants you to become more like them, not stand where you are. And it's very hard because you're getting the push, and it's hard internally to stay in your space because we all want to belong, we all want to be part of. And so that natural drift into other roles is really easy. And so this is both training, making sure people are aware what the role is, making sure people are in a place in their recovery where they can build those shielding resiliency tools so that they don't take in everything there, but can sort of bounce it off of them. It's not an easy role. And as Jethro says, it's exhausting
Right.
to always be educating people, always trying to get people to understand it, always trying to, bide your tongue, say enough, but not too much. Like you're always at work with both the people you're supporting and with the staff that you're trying to educate as you're writing this middle role, right? It's very challenging. And I want to just acknowledge that Benton has joined us from Uganda. So lovely to have you here, Benton. And Benton had asked a couple of questions, really even just about revealing. This isn't so much about being in a peer worker role, but just as you go into a work setting, how do you harmonize? I love that work. I think we're far away from harmonizing, Benton, but how can one harmonize peer support and mental health advocacy while working in mental health institutions? And when should one disclose mental health status to an employer, bearing in mind that this can put people at risk of losing the job? Of course, if somebody's a peer supporter,
Right.
just that role discloses, I'm a person with lived experience of mental health challenges. That's why I can do this role. We know that all the states are different, all the countries are different. I know in the United States, before we had dedicated peer roles, there were many of us out there working in agencies and making decisions to reveal our history in order to use our voice to make changes in the agency we were working with. And I think those decisions are really hard. It depends on what laws you have in your state or your country that will protect people. In the United States, we've got a law, the Americans with Disabilities Act, which makes it really hard for people to fire you because you've revealed your mental health issues. That doesn't mean that they can't find another way to fire you because you told them and they want to get rid of you, and they know they can't do it directly because you revealed your mental health challenges, right? So it's always a hard individual decision.
Yeah, I wanted to, sorry.
No, please.
No, I wanted to connect with that because I think also thinking about this question about disclosing, which wasn't exactly the focus of my study, but thinking about the question because it did come up in some of the conversations. And it really is something first that depends on your context, as Lynn was saying, really requires careful consideration. And I guess some conversations with people you really trust around this, to have some support on that from others. But also to know that there's not a one-size-fits-all answer for this. It really is something that each person needs to decide for themselves.
Yeah.
And based on their context, where they are in their career or work, what work they're doing. So it really is I just wanted to add to that it really is a, kind of unique. Each person needs to do that based on their specific circumstances. Otherwise, you just can't say, do it or don't do it. So it's a really, really important thing to consider.
I'm sorry.
Oh, fine.
Yeah, I think helping people to think through those choices, right? I always like to do the 5 W's: who, what, when, where, and why, right? Who am I going to disclose to? When am I going to do it? Why am I going to do it? Is there a reason to do it that's going to be valuable to me or not? Sometimes people may just feel pressure to reveal because of their histories of being in mental health systems, where part of the requirement in some ways is reveal all of who you are to everybody, right? Sometimes people have to learn their right to privacy, that they don't have to disclose. But supporting people to think through those decisions, I think is the way we can contribute the best in that decision-making process. Yep.
And just to link with that, just to bring up something that's related, is that I heard in the research was some folks who had been in a different role in their organization, and then moved over, got peer support training, and then moved over into a peer specialist role. And obviously, by the nature of that role, were disclosing their mental health challenges and having a very different experience in the new role, being
Say more
treated
about
very differently.
Yeah.
And so it can be a very, challenging decision to make, and something that you need to consider carefully about the implications of choosing to disclose.
Yes. And I know some of those people that did that same thing, and they got a paid deduction. So just think about that, folks. When people went into a peer support role from another role in an agency that they've been with many years, they got a drop in pay. So we all know how that goes.
Wow.
I've seen a number of questions that I want to address here, and I want to ask specifically if your research came up around this, Anneliese, was when people are working in an organization where they also got services at one point, and what kind of experiences did they have with that? And then I can address it, but I'm wondering, if that came up.
I'm trying to think about, maybe there were 1 or 2 instances of that happening in my research, but it wasn't something that really came up in this particular group. Of course, it was a small group of people. There were 34 participants. So it really wasn't representative of everyone's experiences. But I don't believe that I remember, somebody speaking about that at length.
Yeah. I'm glad, because I hope that's going down. I'll address this briefly. That's one of the things that we really tried to help agencies with as peer support was rolling out, was that's really often not a good fit, because it's very hard for people to unknow what they know, right? And to change hats and to go from being a supporter, your therapist, your counselor, into being a colleague. It's very hard, and I think it's more difficult when that relationship was based on mental health, just because of all the added crap that's on top of having a mental health diagnosis. We know from the research, sadly, that the greatest amount of prejudice against people with mental health challenges is expressed by people who work in the field. Heartbreaking, but it's been replicated over and over. So for people to go from that role of counselor supporter to a colleague is almost impossible. So I think it does add even more layers, and I think it requires a lot more resiliency to be keeping up those barriers and making sure that the people, your now colleagues, are keeping up their barriers and boundaries, and aren't going into your medical records and things like that. And those are the complications that come up. So absolutely, it's a challenging situation. I just say all the resiliency tools that people talk about are probably needed in that setting. So, yeah.
And I think I could imagine that for folks in a situation like that, where they've been served by the organization they now work for, I could think that they feel an extra burden to be strong, to not show weakness, to not show a vulnerability, to not show any kind of, norm. I want to say not just everyday kind of stresses, because I think that people feel that they and they definitely are placed under more of a microscope, you know, being, and that is unfortunately very, very true.
Yeah, it's
In
very hard.
organizations. I have, while you were talking, I was thinking through, and there was one person in my study who had spoken about one of their colleagues. This person had worked in a organization that she had previously been served by, and she did, you know, speak about a situation that she found herself in where one of her previous healthcare providers actually turned on her in a way.
Yeah.
And it was very, very, you know, demoralizing and heartbreaking for that person's experience, because it just adds, as you say, those extra kind of demands and challenges that people have to face
Right.
in the process.
Yeah,
So
if you already have a known history, it's a lot more difficult to overcome than just an imagined history, because they know you're a peer supporter and they're just imagining what your background may have been. When they know what it is, it can be even worse. I want to put a shout out to the substance use community. I know we're really focusing on mental health, and I know there's a lot of parallels and then some differences. Our center is funded just around mental health, but I just want to acknowledge, I know we have some substance use folks on here. And in terms of this, it absolutely is the same process. I think mental health peer supporters, like substance use peer supporters, are being co-opted. We're fighting against co-optation on a daily basis, whether that be the medical model of mental health or the more and more medical model of substance use. You know, we're almost going in different directions, where substance use started as a field of people with lived experience. That's the roots of the entire substance use field, but it's gotten more and more medicalized over the years, and more difficult to be there as a person with lived experience. And we've always been medicalized on our side of mental health, but it's not moving away from that. That's so ensconced. And so we find in both fields, people with lived experience trying to be valued in their work setting with varying degrees of success with that, often agency to agency, right? So thanks for the contributions from the substance use folks. Didn't want to think you were being ignored here. Glad you're here. I think there was another question I was seeing. Let me see. I'm scrolling the chat. If I missed a question you put in a while ago, feel free to throw it in again, because I might have missed it at this point. Oh, I love this. I just want to share something from the chat. Someone says the agency where I work has a group of peers in recovery, not staff, who speak in college and high school classes about what it is to live with and be in recovery from mental health and or substance use challenges. I love that. To me, it's just a personal, this is not I'm not speaking for the Center of Psych Rehab. I'm just speaking for Lynn. I believe stories are what changes minds. And I think we have to have more and more stories out there in colleges, in graduate school, all of that. But I digress.
now I can add to that. I mean, narratives are really, really what we call narrative stories. In research, we talk about narratives. And there are a group of researchers that actually do quite a bit of work on that, have putting stories online to support folks. So if you're interested in that kind of work, I can, you know, send you some material from those folks there in England, in Britain. And they've done some research on that. So very interesting and very important work, because I absolutely agree with you. Lynn, stories are what make people connect, and that's what we want to do as humans, right? We want to connect.
And I just want to highlight for you, y'all, if you're not watching the chat, people are putting in great resources and links for other studies that have been done similar to find out the experience of health workers. Thanks, Elizabeth, for posting that. And I want to address one thing. I think this also, it's a little different than what your research is about, but very often grants or advisory councils, right? Many things that sort of help agencies get grants and do projects require that there be people with lived experience or peer workers or something of that iteration represented on that team. And the question always is, how much is that person invited to participate, oriented to the process so they know how to participate? Are they asked really what their view is on it, or are they just a body in a room because it checks off the mark, right? We're still working with so many of these areas where we're devalued and people truly don't recognize the value of that lived experience and how it is an add-on, not a must-do. We're not there yet.
And I think, this has been the fantastic experience of working with you all at the Center for Psych Rehab, is I think our center really lives up to that, really involving people with lived experience in our research processes, in, thinking about research from the start, what do people want researched, because researchers can decide on a topic and you take it to people who it's, supposed to be benefiting, and they go, we don't want to know about that. We want to know about this and this, So, and that's really important, that you address with research the things that people really need. And that's the wonderful experience of being at the center, is just having that integration of, what I call professional experts and experts by experience, having that, because we come from we bring different strengths to the research experience.
Absolutely. And Ken, I've been chatting back and forth, but Ken was bringing in, of course, the importance of neurodiversity, right? And embracing the power of differences and uniquenesses. And in some ways, we're all in our silos, trying to do the same thing, trying to say a diagnosis is not a destiny.
Right.
And Ken was sharing about someone with autism with the same, trying to travel the same road, right? People that don't have English as their first language, right? People that live in different communities, and peer support needs to be tailored for their local needs, right? All of this, we still have so much growing to do. And sometimes it's hard to know where you focus. Do you go back and get some of those basics back there because they're being deteriorated? Or do you hope as you grow and widen that they get reformed? It's a movement, and it's always that forward and back, right? And I think we're still doing a lot of the basics. I just saw elephant in the room, so that piques my curiosity.
Okay.
Yes. So what somebody's saying is when people are actually working in environments that have a lot of coercion, is sort of this almost full circle to our first question about working in forensic settings. Same thing in involuntary commitment settings. Peers work in a lot of places that go totally against the value of peer support. And so I think the question always comes down to our choices of, can I bring authentic enough, in my own personal opinion, peer support to this environment to make it worthwhile despite the challenges. And I think we all choose differently on those. Some people say we never should have brought peer support into behavioral health because it's getting so co-opted. I say, as somebody who was in mental health institutions for 50 years and never heard the word recovery, damn, I wish there had been peer supporters in there, despite how difficult the environments are, right? So I think we're trying every day to do our best.
Yeah, and I think, thanks, John, for that comment also, because I think really what I'm also hearing there is that, that the folks in those settings, that peer specialists need to be in those settings. I think as peer specialists, the demandingness of the environment, I think peer specialists in those environments, as I said initially, need to find the support in order to do their work there. And I think that it's really, just so important to keep at it, and finding the support, finding those groups, colleagues and other settings that can support you in continuing the good work. And I want to say in various projects that I've been involved with at the center, I must say I really am so humbled by the work that peer support specialists do, because I have not heard a peer specialist that I spoke to saying they give up. They just don't. Peer specialists don't give up. And despite the challenges of the situations, they choose to stay because they feel a strong loyalty towards the people that they serve. Very often to their own detriment, right?
Right. We did a coaching program separate from the research that Anneliese did. We did a coaching program, coaching peer support workers who were feeling distressed by their job, burnout, maybe getting ready to quit just because of the job. And so we did coaching with them. And what we saw over and over and over was exactly what you're speaking of, Anneliese. People maybe were distressed about the agency. They were distressed about how the agency looked at peer workers, but they were so committed to the work that they did with people that they were supporting, and hung in there. Peer support work isn't a job, right? Peer support work is a passion, right? There's always that extra thing that goes with it. And we've sort of siloed, even here in this webinar, the prejudice and discrimination of peer workers around their mental health or substance use background. And what we know is that many people go into the work facing this with multiple arenas where they're experiencing stigma and prejudice and discrimination, right? So it may be racial, it may be gender, maybe age, right? And so I think everything we're learning and that Anneliese has been researching are things that we hope also can be thought about with people with multiple, I'm going to use the academic term, multiple stigma experiences, right? Because
those layers of stigma, right? Those layers of prejudice and discrimination that people experience.
Right. But we want to sort of end, and Isabel, thank you for bringing this up. We want to end with the really good news out of this is that peer workers go into their work often not trained well, right? They get maybe a 40-hour training with a whole bunch of info just dropped on them, and then they have to go do the job. So they go into work with maybe not a lot of good training for what they need. They go into environments that are hard, and yet they persist. They're resilient. They use recovery skills to come up with strategies. They find ways to stay. They find ways to keep doing the work. And they find ways to do that in a way that is within their own recovery orientation. They take that and apply it to the work to create resilience and shielding so that they can do the work where their heart is, which is with the people served, not to serve the agency, right? And I for one, applaud every peer worker who does that. I think it's one of the hardest jobs that we have out there, and I salute them. I want to thank you all for being, it's been a great group, lots of interaction, although we are sorry we couldn't see you or see your faces or hear your voices. But thank you for staying on the chat and asking your questions and sharing information for us and for everyone else. It's been absolute delight, and I'll let Anneliese wrap us up.
Absolutely. I want to link with what Lynn says. I mean, of the professions in healthcare, mental health, I think peer specialists are one of the strongest. And it's just absolutely, just really a remarkable role that people take on.
So Anneliese, we had a quick question, I think. Can you wrap it up by listing a few more of
Yes, I saw that question. Yes, thanks, Lynn, for reminding me.
I love that.
So those strategies that I was talking about, and please, I think it was Jethro that asked the question. Please email me, ask me about it. I can give you some more information. But really, I was talking about support seeking, about confrontation, about educating others. Unfortunately, that has two sides to it, but educating others, advocacy, being involved in advocacy, and reinforcing the value of peer support within your organization. There are many others. Please be in touch with me. Ask me about it. I can give you more information on that.
Great. Thank you so much, Anneliese. Thank you for coming and doing this with us. Thank you all for being here. I hope you all have a great afternoon and a great weekend. And
thanks for having
us at any time. Yep.